7 August, Sunday afternoon, 2016, behind me. It's a 4 foot wide, 8 foot long, 2 foot deep, climate controlled worm bin. And in it, I have about 50,000 worms. And initially, this was all horse manure. Now it's complete worm castings. It's about a year old. And so, what I do to feed these worms, I have a special product, and it looks like this. It's a very fine grain that comes from Purina Mills, and it's called Purina Mills Worm Chow. And I'll just demonstrate how fine it is. And that's what I use to feed my worms in this particular setup. I have to water it, and after I water it, then I take this sheet of insulation, just put it on top. It keeps the heat off, and it keeps the worm bin at a nice even temperature. So that's one of the different things that the worms like to eat. The reason why I use this specialized product, it comes in big old bags. This is what I feed my worms. And it costs, I don't know, about $25 to $30 for a 50-pound bag, or whatever that weighs there. And it's Purina Mills Worm Chow. And you have to go to like a feed store in order to have them order it. The problem you might run into it is Purina Mills and Purina are two different companies. Purina makes the dog chow and the cat chow. And Purina Mills is a different company. They make the worm chow. I made the mistake because I was looking to go to Purina, and they didn't know what I was talking about. But I finally figured out that they're two different companies. That's Purina, who make the cat chow and the dog chow, and Purina Mills, which makes the worm chow. And the reason why you want to use their product is because doesn't have the sodium. The sodium, like in chicken mash, eventually will build up, and once there's too much salt in your worm bin, the worms have a hard time finding food. It's basically hostile to microbes or microorganisms in the soil or in your worm bedding. So that's what you're trying to grow, is you want to increase the density and the diversity of the microorganisms, the aerobic bacteria in your worm bins, because once a worm goes through a worm bin, and devours all the organic material in there, they're going to increase the bioorganisms by tenfold. And so that's one of the miracles of working with red worms. They're different from earthworms in that earthworms are burrowing creatures. For instance, a nightcrawler will burrow down 6 feet, possibly come up for a leaf, and then pull it down into its burrow to eat. They're wandering creatures. The non-burrowing worms, the red worms, the red wigglers, the tiger worms, the manure worms, they're all called different names. But basically, they live in organic material. The earthworms, for instance, the nightcrawler is going to live in about 90% dirt, 10% organic material. The horizontal earthworms, they'll live in about 60% dirt and 40% organic material. And then the non-burrowing worms, they live in the top 2 inches of the soil, and they're surface creatures, and so they'll live in about 90% organic material and maybe 10% dirt. So you have to give them an organic matter to live. You just can't put them in the soil; they won't survive. So that's all I got to share on this video. A round satellite dish with about 200,000 worms in it. It's packed with worms. And in the center It's a composting bin, a thermocomposting bin that I use in the winter. Right now it's filled with worms as it's cooled off, but I fill it up with carbon and nitrogen and I heat it up. So when December, January, and February comes along, the heat radiates outward and keeps the worms in the outer diameter of the circle warmer, and they survive the winters quite well here. I just basically have them underneath burlap bags, and there's primarily leaves, maple leaves, straw, and horse manure that they're living in. And beneath me here, or behind me, I have worms living in different substrates. For instance, this is complete horse manure over here. This is horse manure that's been completely composted. It's just nothing but solid worm castings. Over here, I have worms just living in straw and leaves. And over here, I have them living in cow manure. So if I was to show you what this would look like, I'll put my hand in some cow manure. Can you see how many worms I got in my hand? It's like one big giant worm ball. The cow manure just happens to have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 25:1, and they love cow manure. They thrive on it. The rotting straw has worms in it, but they're not as dense. You can see some in my hand here. They're just not as dense as they are in the cow manure, because that's got a better carbon to nitrogen ratio, and there's more bacteria that supports their life form. Now, this is completely composted worm castings from horse manure. And these worms are kind of small. I don't know if we can see them in there. There's some right here. Now the thing of it is, I can make these worms, at least twice as long. I can make that worm twice as long and twice as fat just by feeding it a grain diet. And I'll discuss that when I show you how to make worm bins. And then here, we basically just got horse manure. And we got worms living quite happily in the horse manure. But they're not as abundant as they are in the cow manure due to the aging of this particular horse manure. They're living just fine in it, but it's not the ideal condition as it would be if the manure was just a little bit newer. So I'm trying to demonstrate that the worms can live in different substrates. They could actually just live in paper, just shredded newspaper all year long. However, if you're making a worm tea and you want that biodiversity, you're going to get much more biodiversity out of horse manure or cow manure or organic straw and leaves